Now we're going to talk about the challenge for the Chancellor to fill a bit of a black hole in a budget next month, and I'm delighted to be joined by former Treasury official, head of the Resolution Foundation, Ruth Curtice. Now, I warned people before the break this is going to be a comedy classic. We're going to start with one of my favourite concepts, fiscal headroom. Now, what this means, for those who aren't sort of using it every single day, it's the amount of sort of cushion, rainy day money that the Chancellor has to deal with shocks. And since we had these fiscal rules and had the Office of Budget Responsibility, we can see from this chart that successive chancellors, starting with Osborne, then Hammond, had, anywhere between... Well, there was one point where George Osborne had 80 billion of fiscal headroom, but, it was sort of averaging 30-odd billion for years and years and years. And then Jeremy Hunt did some pre-election tax bribes, cut national insurance, took it down to 10. And then at the start of this Parliament, Rachel Reeves took her rainy day money down to 10. And, of course, the economy has changed since the last budget and it's been wiped away, which is a big reason why she's going to have to raise taxes. So was she just being reckless in having so little headroom?
So, as you say, she had much less headroom than Chancellors in the past. Another way we can think about that is what's the average move every time the OBR do a forecast? That's about 17 billion. So you can think of this as... So
she had even less than the average shock to the system.
Exactly. So the average could go either way, but she's had a bad roll of the dice and she didn't have enough to cover even a typical bad roll of the dice.
Now, if she were to do the prudent thing... Well, should she do the prudent thing in this coming budget and rebuild headroom? And what would that mean as far as you're concerned? How much rainy day money should she tuck away if she's doing the right thing?
Yeah, so headroom can sound a bit abstract.
Yeah.
So we should be clear, when we say more headroom, that means more tax rises or lower spending than would otherwise be the case.
Yeah.
So that's why this is not a straightforward decision. But given that the UK cost of borrowing is now one of the highest amongst rich economies, given we're paying a price in the bond market for our borrowing levels, it does seem like increasing that headroom, also from the Chancellor's point of view. Does she want to be back here again next year, or does she want to allow herself a bit more of a cushion to hopefully mean that this budget is her last tax-raising budget?
But that would mean, and we're going to move on now and talk about her tax options, but let's just say she adds another 20 billion to headroom. So headroom's been wiped out. Just to rebuild the headroom, that's 30 billion. But we know the Office for Budget Responsibility, it's downgraded growth, downgraded productivity, that's another 20 billion. She's got the problem that interest rates are higher than she thought. She's got the problem that she's not made the welfare savings she was expecting to do. So she could be facing 50 billion of... If she rebuilds headroom, she could be facing 50 billion of tax rises. Now, I pointed out before the break, she can't raise any of those taxes on the left because she said in her manifesto she couldn't. So what's she going to do?
So as you say... there's lots of things that she's ruled out. I'd add two things on this chart. One is the blobs are small. The sort of orange blobs are small relative to the other blobs. They're still quite big. So there's still hundreds of billions of pounds of taxes that aren't in her ruled out bucket. But really what we need to think about is, would it be sensible to stick to the commitments not to touch these big tax bases?
So what's the answer?
So we think that she should protect working people, but that she should look at areas where employment is overtaxed relative to other forms of income.
So what would that mean?
So, in particular, one thing she could do is put up income tax but cut national insurance. What that would mean is that anyone's tax on their pay packet would stay the same for people in employment. The self-employed would be asked to pay a little bit more, and pensioners would be asked to pay a little bit more. But, for example, if she did that by 2p, only pensioners earning over £40,000 would be worse off when you take into account the extra money they're going to get from the triple lock next year.
Although I think you agree with me that she's facing raising anywhere between, 25 and 50 billion, right? Your proposal raises how much?
Yeah, so that raises about 6 or 7 billion. So she would have to do a collection.
So where's the rest coming from?
She would have to do a collection of these things. We've set up about 30 billion pounds of proposals for tax rises that she could make that we think would follow these principles of evening out the taxation of different forms of income and recognising that income that is undertaxed relative to employment is an area where, in this very tough situation, she could turn.
Now, one of the interesting things is what the British people would like to see in terms of tax changes. And I thought this was an absolutely fascinating bit of polling by Demos. And they asked all categories of voters, would you rather see higher taxes on work, basically income taxes, or on wealth, which is a rather broad concept? And broadly, in every category, including Reform and the Tories, they all say tax wealth more. Now, I suppose, is that rational? Can she raise enough money from raising so-called wealth taxes?
Well, so briefly, I wouldn't say that tax on work and income tax are the same. There are some forms of income that aren't work, and that is an area we should
Which you've just talked about, which is so unearned income, for example.
Exactly.
You'd like to see national insurance on, wouldn't you?
Exactly. But thinking about kind of the idea of wealth taxes, we do already have some taxes on wealth. I think we should say the kind of economic drivers here, it's understandable why you get results like this. So wealth as a proportion of the economy has something like doubled since the 1980s. Wealth taxes have stayed very constant. So that might be why people feel like we should tax wealth more and we should tax it better. We've got these existing wealth taxes like capital gains tax. They look like easier ways for the Chancellor to find money this autumn than the ideas like an annual wealth tax, which would face a lot of kind of practical challenges.
And just on that, obviously there's been a lot of discussion about, should there be a new top band on expensive houses for council tax? As you say, should she raise the rate of capital gains tax and equalise it with income taxes? But what is the history of pure wealth taxes around the world? Do they work in raising significant sums of money?
So in recent years, we've seen countries move away from annual wealth taxes, not from things like property taxes and capital gains taxes.
And why is that, do you think?
They tend to raise less money than was hoped for, and they tend to see very big behavioural effects, whether those are people leaving the country or whether those are people avoiding the tax, because it's very hard to value some of these forms of wealth. The other thing is most of the wealth in this country is in property and pensions. So when we talk about a wealth tax, we need to think about, are we prepared to tax houses more? Are we prepared to tax pensions more? Because that's where most of the wealth is.
Ruth, it's been a joy having you on the programme. I promised people that it would be a comedy classic. I'm not sure I've quite fulfilled that dream.
Sorry.